Richard Cole stood at the curb, suitcase in hand, the early morning chill biting at his skin despite his thick coat. The sky above JFK Airport was a dull gray, the kind that promised delays. He turned to his wife, Abigail, and gave her a warm smile, though he couldn't help noticing the distant look in her eyes. "I'll call you when I land," he said, leaning in to kiss her cheek. Abigail tilted her head, allowing the kiss to graze her skin, and smiled a practiced smile. "Safe travels," she replied, her voice bright but detached. Richard studied her for a moment longer, his brow furrowing as if he were about to say something else. Instead, he sighed and nodded. "I'll be back in 2 weeks," he reminded her. "If anything comes up, you know where to reach me." Abigail nodded and waved as he entered the terminal. She stood there until he disappeared into the bustling crowd, her hands still raised in a mechanical goodbye. Once he was out of sight, her arm dropped to her side, and her smile vanished like morning dew in the sun. By the time she pulled into the driveway of their pristine suburban home, the melancholy that had clung to her was replaced with nervous anticipation. She double-checked the details on her phone, the text thread with her lover, Eric, confirming he'd arrive shortly, and the group chat with her closest friends inviting them over for an impromptu, catch-up evening. Inside, she set to work transforming their home. Candles were lit, soft jazz spilled from the speakers, and the scent of fresh flowers filled the air. Abigail surveyed the space with a critical eye, her hands smoothing invisible creases from the tablecloth. Everything had to be perfect. At precisely 7, the doorbell rang. Abigail's heart skipped as she opened the door to find Kara, her best friend since college, holding a bottle of wine. Behind her was another friend, Olivia, already talking animatedly about the crazy day she'd had at work. "I can't believe you're having us over while Richard's away," Kara said with a laugh. "Isn't this his big international presentation?" "Oh, he insisted I relax while he's gone," Abigail lied smoothly, stepping aside to let them in. "Besides, it's been ages since we've all been together." The small talk and laughter flowed easily as more guests trickled in, each one filling the house with warmth and camaraderie. When Eric finally arrived, his presence electrified the room. Abigail felt her pulse quicken as his eyes met hers, a private message passed in the briefest of glances. His charm was effortless as he mingled, his wit earning laughter from even the hardest to please among her friends. By the time dinner was served, Abigail's nerves had melted away. She leaned into the evening, the wine and Eric's subtle touches on her arm and lower back adding to her confidence. Her friends were none the wiser, and she reveled in the illusion of control. Just as she was pouring another glass of wine, the sound of a key turning in the front door lock pierced the air. The laughter around the table stilled, and Abigail froze, her hand trembling. She turned toward the door, her stomach dropping as the door swung open. There, framed in the doorway, stood Richard, his suitcase at his side, his face unreadable. The silence stretched, thick and oppressive. Abigail's breath caught as their eyes locked. Richard stepped into the house, closed the door behind him, and looked around the room. His gaze swept over the table, the wine glasses, the spread of food, and finally, the man sitting closest to Abigail. "You," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Out. All of you, out." His tone sent a ripple of unease through the room. The guests exchanged uneasy glances before hastily gathering their things. Eric hesitated, his eyes darting toward Abigail as if waiting for her to intervene. "Eric," Richard said, his eyes narrowing. "I said out." Abigail stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Richard, let's not do this in front of everyone." "Don't you dare try to placate me," Richard cut her off, his voice sharp enough to slice through steel. "Not after this." One by one, the guests filed out, their murmurs dying as the door closed behind them. Eric was the last to leave, and Abigail could feel her pulse hammering as Richard tracked his movements with a predator's intensity. When they were finally alone, Richard dropped his suitcase. The sound echoed in the silent room. "Your flight," Abigail stammered. "You're supposed to be." "Cancelled," Richard said curtly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Apparently, fate decided I needed to come home early." Imagine my surprise when I found a full house and a man I don't recognize making himself comfortable. "Richard, I can explain." "No," he snapped. His voice was calm, almost eerily so. "You're going to pack your things. Tonight." We're getting a divorce, Abigail. Tomorrow. Tears sprang to her eyes, but before she could muster a response, Richard reached for his wedding ring. Slowly, deliberately, he slid it off his finger and marched to the bathroom. Abigail followed, her protests spilling from her lips. Please, she begged. It was just a mistake, a lapse in judgment. I still love. The metallic clink of the ring dropping into the toilet bowl silenced her. Richard flushed it without hesitation and turned back to her, his expression hard. Save your excuses, he said. I've heard enough. Abigail stood in the doorway, trembling as Richard brushed past her. The click of his shoes echoed down the hallway as he made his way upstairs. She sank onto the bathroom floor, her mind racing as the gravity of the situation settled around her. What had been an evening of control and deception had unraveled in mere minutes, and now, she was left with nothing but the cold realization of her choices. Abigail sat motionless on the bathroom floor, her mind racing through 1,000 fragmented thoughts. The faint hum of the flush seemed to mock her, the finality of it reverberating in her chest. She tried to focus, to piece together the words that might save her marriage, or at least stall the implosion of her life. Her reverie was shattered by the sound of Richard descending the stairs. He moved with the quiet, deliberate force of someone who had already made up his mind. His expression was unreadable, his jaw set like stone. He stopped in the doorway, staring down at her with a mixture of disgust and pity. Get up, he said coldly. You look pathetic sitting there. Abigail scrambled to her feet, wiping at her tear-streaked face. Richard, please, just listen to me. Pack your things, you viper, he said, his voice venomous. We're getting a divorce tomorrow, and you're getting out of this house. The words hit her like a physical blow. She staggered backward, gripping the edge of the bathroom sink for support. Richard, don't do this. Please. I made a mistake, but we can work through this. His laugh was hollow, bitter. Work through it? Do you think this is something we can sweep under the rug? I walked into our house, Abigail, and found you playing hostess to your lover and your friends, like some twisted version of a 1950s sitcom. Do you even hear yourself? It wasn't like that, she said, her voice breaking. It wasn't serious, Richard. It didn't mean anything. That's your defense, he asked, his tone incredulous. That it didn't mean anything? Do you have any idea how much worse that makes it? Abigail's lips trembled as she searched for a reply. I didn't plan for this to happen. It just did. I've been feeling so. Don't, Richard interrupted, his voice sharp. Don't you dare try to justify this by blaming me or your feelings. This isn't about what you were lacking, Abigail. This is about what you chose. His words hung heavy in the air, cutting through her defenses like a scalpel. Abigail felt the weight of them pressing down on her, suffocating her. For the first time, the gravity of her actions fully sank in. Where am I supposed to go? She asked softly, tears streaming down her face. This is my home, too. Not anymore, Richard said bluntly. You forfeited that the moment you brought him into it. You can stay at a hotel, or with one of your friends, though I doubt they'll be lining up to host you after tonight. Abigail flinched at the cruelty in his tone but knew he wasn't wrong. Her social circle, as tight-knit as it appeared, thrived on appearances. Scandal like this would be a death knell to her standing among them. I can't believe this is happening, she whispered, sinking onto the couch in the living room. Her eyes darted to the remnants of the evening, wine glasses, a half-empty bottle, and the faint aroma of laughter and warmth now replaced by cold hostility. Richard's gaze followed hers, and his lips curled in disgust. Neither can I, he said. I loved you, Abigail. I trusted you. And you threw it away for him. He grabbed the nearest wine glass and hurled it into the sink with a crash, startling her. The shards sparkled like broken promises against the porcelain. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she said, her voice trembling. It was just a distraction. Something to make me feel alive again. Richard stared at her, his face hardening further. Alive? You want to feel alive? Try being the one who comes home after a cancelled flight to find his wife and her lover laughing in his house. See how alive you feel then. Abigail opened her mouth to respond but found she had nothing to say. Her carefully constructed facade had crumbled, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. "I'll be upstairs," Richard said flatly. "You have until tomorrow morning to figure out where you're going." "I'm done." He turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the dimly lit living room. The sound of his footsteps on the stairs echoed in her ears, each one a reminder of the life she had destroyed. As the reality of her situation settled over her, Abigail wiped her tears and began to move mechanically, gathering her things into a suitcase. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, its rhythm an ominous countdown to the end of her marriage. But deep inside, a part of her clung to a desperate hope. Maybe there was still a chance to fix this. Maybe Richard's anger would cool, and he would see that she was still the woman he had loved. For now, though, all she could do was pack and pray. The house was eerily quiet as Abigail shuffled to the upstairs bathroom. Her suitcase lay half-packed on the bed, the task abandoned in favor of futile attempts to plead with Richard. Every attempt was met with a stony silence or a sharp rebuke, and now she was left teetering on the edge of despair. She found Richard in the master bathroom, standing over the sink, his hands gripping the edges of the counter. His tie was gone, and his shirt was wrinkled from hours of tension. Abigail lingered in the doorway, her arms folded tightly across her chest. "Richard," she began, her voice trembling. "Can we please talk? You can't just throw everything away." He turned his head slightly, just enough for her to see the hard set of his jaw. "Throw everything away," he echoed, his voice a low rumble. "Funny. That's exactly what you did." His eyes flicked to his left hand, to the band of gold that had rested there for nearly 10 years. Abigail's stomach twisted as she followed his gaze. There was a finality in the way he regarded the ring, as if he were preparing to exorcise it from his life. "Richard, don't," she whispered, taking a step closer. "Please. I made a mistake, but we can work through this. We owe it to everything we've built together." He interrupted her with a sharp, mirthless laugh. "Everything we've built together? Abigail, do you even hear yourself? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Abigail faltered, her hands clasped together as though in prayer. "I know I hurt you. But I never stopped loving you, Richard. That has to count for something." He shook his head, his lips curling in disgust. "You don't get to define love, Abigail. Not after what I walked in on tonight." He turned back to the counter, his fingers finding the smooth band of gold. Slowly, deliberately, he slid the ring off his finger. Abigail's breath caught in her throat as she watched, unable to move or speak. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, suffocating her. "Richard," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't do this. We can fix this. I'll do anything, counseling, therapy, whatever it takes." He held the ring up to the light, turning it between his fingers as if examining an artifact from a long-lost life. "Anything, huh?" he said, his tone cold. "Too late for that, Abigail. There's nothing left to fix." Without another word, he turned to the toilet. The porcelain gleamed under the harsh bathroom light as he dropped the ring into the bowl. The sound of metal hitting water was louder than it had any right to be, and Abigail gasped. "Richard, no," she cried, rushing forward. But it was too late. He reached out and pressed the lever, and the rush of water swallowed the ring, carrying it away into the depths. Abigail froze, her hand outstretched as though she could somehow undo what had just happened. The sound of the flush faded, leaving only the heavy silence of the moment. Richard straightened, his gaze fixed on her. His eyes, once warm and full of life, now seemed hollow, devoid of anything resembling love or compassion. "That's it," he said simply. "That's all it took to erase us." Abigail sank to the floor, her knees giving out beneath her. "How can you do this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "How can you just let go like that?" Richard crouched down to meet her eye level, his expression hard. "How could you?" he shot back. "How could you betray me like that and still expect me to hold on? This," he gestured to the toilet, "is the only closure you're getting." He rose to his feet and left the bathroom, leaving Abigail to crumble in his absence. The next morning dawned gray and cold, a mirror of the storm brewing inside Abigail. She sat at the kitchen table, clutching a mug of coffee she couldn't bring herself to drink. The house felt empty despite Richard moving about upstairs, gathering the last of his things. When he finally appeared, dressed sharply in a suit, his expression was unreadable. He placed a stack of papers on the table in front of her. "Sign these," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. Abigail stared at the documents, her hands trembling. "Divorce papers?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard nodded. "I had them expedited. I've already signed. All that's left is your signature." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes as she picked up the pen. "Does it have to be like this?" she asked. "Can't we try one more time?" "No," Richard replied. "We're done." The words hit her like a slap, but she forced herself to sign. Her hand shook as she scrawled her name on the dotted line, each stroke of the pen feeling like another nail in the coffin of their marriage. When it was done, Richard took the papers without a word and left the room. The sound of the front door closing behind him was like a gunshot, echoing through the now empty house. Abigail sat there for a long time, staring at the papers and the hollow space where her husband had stood. She had lost everything, her marriage, her home, and the man who had once been the center of her world. And it was all her fault. The silence in the house was oppressive, a weight pressing on Abigail's chest as she sat alone in the aftermath of the divorce. The papers lay on the kitchen table, a grim testament to the life she had shattered. For hours, she remained motionless, staring at the clock as it ticked relentlessly forward. But as the minutes dragged on, anger began to replace her despair. Anger at herself for her mistakes, at Richard for his cold finality, and even at the absurdity of the situation. How had it all spiraled so far out of control? By mid-afternoon, Abigail resolved to pull herself together. She needed clarity, a path forward. First, she decided, she would pack her things and move out, as Richard demanded. She climbed the stairs to the bedroom they had once shared, every step feeling like a farewell to a life she no longer recognized. As she opened the closet to retrieve her belongings, something caught her eye. In the back, tucked behind a row of pressed suits and seldom-worn jackets, was a black leather briefcase. It wasn't Richard's usual work bag, this one was unfamiliar, worn, and slightly scuffed at the edges. Abigail hesitated, curiosity battling her sense of propriety. But the thought of her own betrayal, and Richard's merciless reaction, pushed her forward. If he could flush 10 years of marriage down the toilet, she reasoned, surely she had the right to open a forgotten bag. Her fingers fumbled with the latches before the case popped open with a soft click. Inside, she found neatly organized files and a small, inconspicuous notebook. Frowning, Abigail pulled it out and flipped through the pages. Her breath caught in her throat. The pages were filled with notes, times, dates, names, all written in Richard's precise handwriting. At first glance, it seemed like work documentation, but as she read further, a chilling realization dawned on her. The notes detailed a series of meetings with individuals Abigail didn't recognize. Phrases like, transfer confirmed, security breach resolved, and, cleanup complete, jumped out at her. What on earth had Richard been involved in? Her pulse quickened as she reached a page dated just a week ago. It listed a name she recognized, Eric. Her lover's name. Beside it were chilling words, target confirmed. Exposure imminent. Proceed with caution. Abigail's stomach churned. She turned the page, and her heart stopped. A grainy black and white photo of Eric, standing outside a nondescript building, was paperclipped to the next entry. Scrawled beneath it was a single sentence, observation ongoing. Terminate if necessary. Terminate. The word echoed in her mind, its implication slicing through her thoughts like a blade. She staggered back, clutching the notebook to her chest as a rush of nausea overwhelmed her. Suddenly, a noise downstairs snapped her out of her panic. The sound of the front door opening, followed by the heavy thud of footsteps, sent her heart into overdrive. Richard wasn't supposed to be back. Not yet. Abigail shoved the notebook back into the briefcase, closing it with shaking hands. She turned just as Richard appeared in the doorway, his eyes narrowing when he saw her standing by the closet. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. I was packing," she stammered, stepping away from the briefcase. "What are you doing here? I thought you were gone for the day." Richard's eyes flicked to the open closet, then back to her. He didn't respond immediately, his jaw tightening as he crossed the room. Abigail's heart raced as he reached for the briefcase, his movements deliberate and precise. "Did you touch this?" he asked, holding up the bag. She hesitated, her mind scrambling for an answer. "No," she lied. "I was just moving things around." Richard's gaze bore into her, and for a moment, she thought he would call her bluff. But instead, he turned and walked out of the room, the briefcase in hand. Abigail waited until she heard the sound of his car pulling out of the driveway before collapsing onto the bed. Her hands trembled as she buried her face in them, trying to make sense of what she had seen. Richard wasn't just angry or vengeful, he was dangerous. And Eric, was he in danger? Was this why Richard had reacted so coldly, so ruthlessly? Because there was more to his knowledge of the affair than she realized. She grabbed her phone and dialed Eric's number, her fingers fumbling over the keys. It rang twice before going to voicemail. Panic clawed at her throat as she tried again, with the same result. Pick up," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Finally, she sent a text, "Eric, call me. It's urgent. Please." Hours passed with no response. By nightfall, Abigail's fear had escalated into full-blown dread. She paced the living room, her mind replaying the entries in Richard's notebook. The thought of Eric alone, unaware of the threat hanging over him, was unbearable. Then, just as she was about to call him again, the doorbell rang. Abigail froze. Her first instinct was to ignore it, but the persistent chime forced her forward. She opened the door cautiously, her breath catching when she saw a man she didn't recognize. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Cole?" he asked. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a badge, flashing it briefly before tucking it away. "Special Agent Davis," he said. "I'm here about your husband." Abigail's blood ran cold. "My husband? What's going on?" Agent Davis's expression softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "Mrs. Cole, I need you to come with me. There's something you need to know." Abigail hesitated on the doorstep, her pulse hammering in her ears. Special Agent Davis stood still, his presence both authoritative and unsettling. The air between them seemed to hum with unspoken tension. "What's going on?" Abigail repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean about my husband?" Davis gestured toward an unmarked black sedan parked at the curb. "Please, Mrs. Cole. It's better if we discuss this somewhere more private." Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to slam the door and lock herself inside, but curiosity and a gnawing sense of dread propelled her forward. She grabbed her coat, casting one last glance at the house before stepping into the cold night. The car ride was tense, Davis remaining silent until they reached a nondescript government building on the edge of town. Inside, Abigail was led to a small, sterile room with a single table and 2 chairs. Davis motioned for her to sit. She sank into the chair, her palms slick with sweat. "What is this about?" Davis placed a file on the table and opened it. The first page bore Richard's photo, accompanied by a list of aliases. Abigail's eyes widened as she skimmed the names, her breath catching when she reached the word operative. "Your husband," Davis began, "is not the man you thought he was. Richard Cole, if that's even the name you know him by, has been working as a covert intelligence operative for the past 12 years. Abigail blinked, shaking her head. "No. That's impossible. Richard is a corporate consultant. He works with data systems. Cover stories are his specialty," Davis said, flipping through more pages. "He's been involved in high-level surveillance, counterintelligence, and, more recently, asset elimination. His job is to identify threats and neutralize them." Abigail stared at the file, her hands trembling. "Why are you telling me this? What does this have to do with me?" Davis sighed, his expression softening. "Because you've inadvertently become part of one of his assignments. The man you've been involved with, Eric, is not just your lover. He's a person of interest in an ongoing investigation. Richard has been monitoring him for months, and your affair put you directly in the crossfire." Abigail's stomach dropped. "What?" "No, Eric is he's just." "Eric Miller," Davis interrupted, pulling out another file, is suspected of embezzling funds from multiple corporations and funneling them to shell accounts tied to criminal enterprises. He's been under watch for years, and your husband was tasked with building a case against him. The room spun. Abigail clutched the edge of the table, her mind racing. But if that's true, then, what's going to happen to him? Davis closed the file, his face grim. That depends. Richard's methods are unorthodox. We've lost track of him since last night, and we believe he may have gone rogue. Rogue? Abigail whispered. You think he's going to hurt Eric? Davis didn't answer directly. We need to find Richard before he does something that can't be undone. Abigail returned home hours later, her mind a whirl of confusion and dread. The house felt colder, emptier, as though the walls themselves had turned against her. She paced the living room, clutching her phone, debating whether to call Eric again. But if what Davis had said was true, her call could inadvertently lead Richard straight to him. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and froze. It was a text from Richard. Come to the old bridge on Route 17. Alone. Midnight. Her breath hitched. She checked the time, 11:47 p.m. Without thinking, she grabbed her keys and drove into the night. The bridge loomed ahead, shrouded in mist and illuminated only by the weak glow of her headlights. Abigail parked and stepped out of the car, her hands trembling. Richard was already there, standing at the edge of the bridge, his silhouette rigid against the night. You came, he said without turning around. I had to, Abigail replied, her voice shaking. What are you doing, Richard? Why did you bring me here? He turned then, his face shadowed but his eyes piercing. In his hand was a small manila envelope. He extended it toward her. What's this? She asked, taking it cautiously. Proof, he said simply. Of everything. Eric's crimes. My mission. And your betrayal. Abigail's hands shook as she opened the envelope. Inside were photos, documents, and surveillance records, everything Davis had hinted at and more. Her stomach churned as she realized the depth of the deception surrounding her. But why, she whispered. Why show me this now? Because you need to understand, Richard said, his voice softer now. When I flush someone out of my life, it's not just a metaphor. Eric isn't walking away from this unscathed. Neither are you. Her blood ran cold. Richard, what are you saying? He stepped closer, his face inches from hers. I gave you everything, Abigail. And you threw it away for someone who doesn't even care about you. Now you get to live with the consequences. Before she could respond, the roar of approaching engines filled the air. A fleet of black SUVs pulled onto the bridge, their headlights cutting through the mist. Agents spilled out, shouting commands. Richard Cole, step away from her. Hands where we can see them. Richard didn't move. His gaze held hers for a long, agonizing moment before he whispered, Goodbye, Abigail. He turned and climbed onto the bridge railing. Abigail screamed, rushing toward him, but the agents restrained her. With one last glance, Richard let himself fall, disappearing into the darkness below. The days that followed were a blur of interrogations and media frenzy. Richard's body was never recovered, leaving Abigail to grapple with the weight of his secrets, and her own guilt. Eric disappeared, his crimes exposed, but Abigail couldn't bring herself to care. She was left alone, haunted by the man she had loved, the choices she had made, and the life she could never reclaim. And in the quiet moments, when the house was still and the shadows crept in, she couldn't shake the feeling that Richard was still out there, watching, waiting. A ghost of the man he once was. A consequence of the life she had destroyed.